Hey everybody, TacticAngel back on the PlayStation 5 to talk about the Project 69 battlecruiser, which appears in World of Warships Legends as the Kronstadt, a Tier 8 premium cruiser. For this review, we'll start with some history, move into analysis, discuss commanders, run down the stats with you, and finish off with some gameplay. If you do want to skip around at all, you should see some time codes down in the description to help you out. The Kronstadt is a representation of the Project 69 heavy cruiser, though for a variety of reasons you will hear these referred to as battle cruisers. The general concept for these cruisers began in 1934 while the Soviet Research Institute for Military Shipbuilding of the Naval Forces Administration and the Italian company of Ansaldo were working together. That work would lay the groundwork for eventually the Kirov-class light cruiser, but when designs were submitted in 1935 based on some of that work, they were rejected. Designers were asked to try again, this time with something heavier than the original 15,500 to 19,500 ton design, with a target weight of around 23,000 tons. This would become Project 22. That also didn't go anywhere because in 1936 the Soviets began negotiating with the British for what would eventually become the Anglo-Soviet Quantitative Naval Agreement of 1937, which would bind Russia to similar displacement on its capital ships, as was in the Second London Naval Treaty. This led the design teams to take the work that had been done on the Project 25 battleships, scale it to fit the new treaty parameters and redesigned role for treaty area cruiser killer, and go with that. 4 ships of Project 25 design were ordered in 1937, but weren't we supposed to be talking about Project 69 cruisers? Right? Well, Project 25 ended a few months after that. Stalin launched the Great Purge, which was basically the already rampant and egregious targeting of political enemies and ethnic minorities just turned up to 11. The Great Purge saw the 2 lead designers arrested, probably without reason, and executed within the year. In this time, the greenlit Project 25 was suddenly deemed unfit for purpose. Instead, the work for a suitable heavy cruiser would continue with Project 69. Due to the shifting landscape, or seascape, this design would need to be able to engage, and even beat, ships like the German pocket battleships of the Deutschland class and Scharnhorst class battleships, which, based on their assessment, far exceeded the capabilities of a treaty-era cruiser, but were definitely not full-strength battleships. This is where you would see the battlecruiser term logically slip in. Up until this point, the projects I've talked about featured a variety of artillery sizes between 10, 11, and 12 inches. But the changing landscape of sea meant that the Project 69 battlecruisers would need to be able to take on the Scharnhorsts. Based on war games, they determined that the 12-inch Project 69 would be superior to the Scharnhorsts in direct battle, a probably optimistic appraisal since that would require a Soviet ship to actually leave port, but if you think that would ever happen, it should have also been able to handily dispatch treaty-era cruisers, even if it would have been marginally slower than some of them. Optimistically, 16 ships were planned, and 2 were actually laid down in November 1939, the Kronstadt in Leningrad and the Sevastopol in Nikolaev. Only a few months behind schedule, Kronstadt was named for a portion of St. Petersburg, at this point referred to by the Soviets as Leningrad, on the island of Kotlin. In English, this typically is spelled without the H, which reflects the German lineage of the name, which means Crown City. In any case, the ambition of this building plan would prove to be the smallest problem for the project, though, and one easy to rectify. As it turned out, in 1940, the Soviets realized that these 12-inch guns that would allow them to easily defeat the Scharnhorst so handily didn't actually really exist and wouldn't be ready for several years. For that matter, neither did the 152mm or 100mm secondary turrets, or the quad 37mm AA. So in 1940, the ambitious 16-ship fleet got cut down to 4, The stopgap solution for a battlecruiser without guns was pretty straightforward. Though perhaps mildly comical, they asked the Germans if they wouldn't mind selling them some of those fancy 11.1-inch Scharnhorst guns. Seeing that they were out of stock, though, Germany offered to sell them these same 380mm artillery that were intended to be used on the upgraded Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. The Soviets agreed to buy those instead, with delivery set to begin in October 1941. The ship you see on screen is therefore something of the Soviet fever dream before they realized that their reach greatly exceeded their grasp. Work would continue on Kronstadt and Sevastopol to do all the things necessary to convert this design into something that could accept twin 15-inch gun turrets, a task that, from the sounds of it, may never actually have been completely worked out either. But, as it turns out, this massive country could not support the simultaneous production of the Sovietsky Soyuz and Kronstadt classes of ships, a fact which is also at least partially attributed to the Soviet Union's mass execution and internment of educated and skilled workers throughout Russia and other occupied nations. Smart people and skilled workers are something that you need for shipbuilding. A fact that was illustrated by the Soviet Union failing to build a ship larger than an 8,000-ton cruiser in the entire interwar period. In any case, the failure of the planners to plan, the design problems, the delivery problems, the labor problems, all of these were made moot in a matter of speaking when Germany invaded with Operation Barbarossa in July 1941. At that point, nearly 2 years into construction, the Kronstadt and Sevastopol were each just over 10% complete 2 years into construction. Both would be cannibalized for material throughout the war by both sides, and like the Soviet Union herself, neither were worth completing after the war, and they were scrapped. But as for this ship in-game, it does get some points for at least a portion of it actually existing. And that pretty much finishes off the history of the Kronstadt. The Kronstadt enters the game as the first premium tier 8 cruiser in the game, and it's barely a cruiser at all. Featuring a large main battery and tons of hit points, Kronstadt is very similar to some other battle cruisers that we've seen in other campaigns. For strength, she has a ton of HP, more than any other cruiser in the game at any tier, more than some tier 8 battleships, and more than most battleships at tier 7. She has respectable speed, a decent turning circle, and acceptable rudder, which makes her feel responsive at speed. She isn't going to dodge a lot of shots, but at range you will be able to adjust your angle fast enough to avoid some damage. And like most Russian high-tier cruisers, she is gifted with radar, a utility which cannot be understated, helping to keep destroyers at bay. You do pay for this in terms of your protection in other ways, though. Your bow will not stop anything like 15-inch shells or larger guns, and though you have a decent belt and the citadel sits a bit lower than most Soviet battleships, it is still very exposed in the front and rear of the ship, and you're even less protected if someone chooses to come at you from the sky, as Kronstadt has strong enough AA, in my experience, to shoot down about 1 Kaga aircraft per run. That's not going to dissuade a Kaga from attacking you, since it has 48 planes or something at the beginning of the game, and it's not going to dissuade anything else with more sturdy aircraft, I can tell you that. And at least while you're in the game, you have a pretty unreliable main battery, which is more in common with the performance of battleships, while not having nearly the punching power of either battleships or Soviet heavy cruisers. The kinds of people who will enjoy this ship and perform well in it are the kinds of people who perform well in ships like Azuma and Siegfried, and know how to handle themselves in an Alaska, particularly around ships like Yamato and Musashi. The ship can be incredibly tough if played correctly, and your primary purpose in-game is often as a punching bag and mobile radar station. If you aren't careful though, people who know where to shoot this ship, and even likely people who don't, will pick you apart pretty easily. Players who excel will know when to support a push on a destroyer, when to bully cruisers, and when to angle and hope for the best against superior firepower. As for your commander choices, there are some notable advantages to using Kuznetsov. Like other Soviet cruisers, most of this just comes down to range rather than fire chance. Your slow reload means you just won't get much out of fire. Instead, intuitive is a useful skill for a utility cruiser, and you're going to enjoy a little extra accuracy that you definitely need. Unfortunately, your turrets are going to feel pretty bad, particularly if you choose main battery in slot 4, since main battery in slot 1 is one of the many things keeping your shots on the same map. Alternatively, Makarov can also give you intuitive, which is, again, useful, but you'll be a bit short on range. This limits you somewhat in terms of reaction time, but he has several skills that wrap your entire ship in something like bubble wrap, reducing overall damage and keeping your modules in the game. He also can get respectable turret traverse, even if all this extra protection comes at the cost of your guns. If you're stuck with Von Essen, I would probably not even bother. Though you do gain some better penetration angles, it's not going to make this feel all that much like a Soviet heavy cruiser. You can almost easily get stealth radar, since Look at Me Now in Makawa will get you below 11.7 if you're well leveled. But other than that, Von Essen is pretty much a waste, and you have close to nothing offered by your third slot skill, even on the best of days. Instead, Kedrov actually would make a reasonable third option, since you can throw on some extra fire protection, limit the number of fires on your ship, and really juice the healing potential that you get out of each one of those healing charges. Also, technically, 20% of 71,000 hit points is over 14k, so there is that. Downside, like everyone else on this list, is poor gun performance, and you're only going to have 2 radars here, though that's usually enough. As we jump into stats, we will be comparing this to the field, whatever that means. There's not a lot of ships at this tier at this point, so let's just jump into it. Survivability is a bit of a mixed bag here with 71,000 hit points. There's no cruiser in the game that has more at any tier. In fact, this number is so high that you can take 2 citadels from almost any battleship in the game, and you only kind of enter into typical tier 8 cruiser hit points. You've got more than functional armor, listed here as 13 to 330 millimeters. If we look at the armor model though, you're going to have a conspicuous section of green on the bow of the ship. Battleships, with a few exceptions, punch straight through this. Cruisers can't do it, so you can sit bow into them more or less and deny almost all AP damage, unless they find a limited amount of superstructure that you offer to shoot. That said, 25 millimeters of armor isn't going to repel a lot of HE, and that's probably what they're going to shoot at you. From the side, your upper belt is 27 millimeters, which means this will take 16-inch shells at any angle, and the 230 millimeter belt is pretty healthy for a cruiser. Pulling back the laders, we have some good news and some bad news. Bad news is that the citadel of this ship extends further forward and further back on the ship than you would expect, and they extend all the way to the outside of the ship. This allows all manner of citadels to happen if you're not giving an angle. Also, the top of these sections are hilariously just 15 millimeters, which means plunging fire will again go right through that. The good news is that the central section of your citadel is spaced and 90 millimeters on either side. That spaced armor is what's making up 25% of your torpedo protection, which is good for a cruiser, but this is kind of a battleship, so there you go. Kronstadt's main battery is unlikely to leave too many people with a favorable impression. With 9 12-inch main battery guns ranging out to 16 kilometers, at least they look interesting for a cruiser. The reload is also long for a cruiser, but it sits between Alaska and Azuma, so it does make a bit of sense. This turret traverse is frankly very much a high-tier battleship turret traverse, which feels frankly pretty terrible if you want to fix that with main battery reload. Your AP does 9,000 damage, which is good for 12-inch guns, but it probably won't surprise you that this combines for a below average damage over time at the tier, And unlike the Russian heavy cruiser line and the Stalingrad above this, these AP shells do not get improved penetration angles. Instead, the shells of choice on Kronstadt, unless you're gifted with the opportunity to dunk on a cruiser or battleship at close or medium range, is probably actually HE, just to keep people occupied and annoyed. You're definitely not a good fire starter, but I wouldn't invest anything to try to change that. With 12-inch guns, you can't punish the front of cruisers or battleships with AP, except for a few. And below all these iffy main battery stats, you can see this ship also has main battery accuracy closer to a battleship than a cruiser. So landing your shells where you want them with any consistency is not likely to happen at range. Kronstadt has no torpedoes, which is worth saying because it is something of a rarity among Russian cruisers, so we'll just skip to AA, which is actually something that you don't have any of either. Okay, not actually zero in this case, but when the Kronstadt looks longingly at the Ibuki AA values, you know it's pretty terrible. Ranging out to 5 kilometers, you put out a combined 175 damage. You're in Musashi levels of bad AA for this big boy. You do have the option to take DFAA. You'd probably need to be pretty dented to do that though. The long and short of it is that carrier players are probably going to figure it out pretty easily to pick on you, and carrier players are going to figure that out pretty quickly given the number of Kronstadts that will be out there. When we come to maneuverability, there's actually not much to complain about here. Though she's a big girl, she's pretty much down the middle in terms of speed and turning circle. Though I suspect that 840-meter turning circle will ultimately be a little on the wide side, it's a lot tighter than Donskoi's 970. The rudder is a bit slow compared to Azuma, Alaska, and Siegfried, but she does seem to turn pretty well for a big girl, very much in the same ballpark as Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Kronstadt's concealment is bad, with 14.7 kilometers without camo. You're tied for the worst detectability with other Soviet cruisers. With camo, concealment mod, and 2 skills in concealment, you can get this below 11.7, which is your radar range, and you will still sneak in under every battleship like that. You share a similar disadvantage from air and while firing from smoke. These are no surprises. Since you have big guns, you're going to be very detectable. Coming to consumables, the first thing that you'll notice here is that though you look like a battleship, you have a cruiser damage control party. This means an unlimited number of charges once per minute. After that, you have the most important consumable that you're going to have, which is radar. Similar to other ships of the Red Fleet, you have suspiciously long range, Soviet technology, but it only lasts 20 seconds. With intuitive and your aim dialed before using it, you can get off 2 salvos, but this is probably much more useful to people on your team, or more specifically in your division. You do have the option of trading this out for DFAA, don't. After that, we have 2 heals, though with high HP, you heal a pretty good amount. Then finally, we have fighters, which are nothing special. And now with all that out of the way, we'll jump into some gameplay. Obviously, we're going to be on Sleeping Giant. And there we have the Kronstadt, which is, if nothing else, a very nicely painted ship. As we look around to see what we're going up against, I'll go ahead, throw my commander up on the screen. We have a couple of things out there that we're going to need to pay attention to, mostly things like Musashi or Georgia. In any case, what we've got here is a situation where we're trying to get the most range out of this ship as possible, while also giving away the least amount of visibility by taking these 2 gentlemen, Yezisfisky and Gunichi Mikawa, as inspirations. That'll help me get below stealth radar so that when I get spotted by myself, I know that I'm being chased by a destroyer. Other things of note here is that I've taken intuitive in slot 2. And that's mostly just so when I do want to shoot at a destroyer that's chasing me, I know what direction he's in, because I'm only going to get 2 shots at best. Got to make sure that my guns are already on target when I hit that button. And at this point, what we're basically trying to do is get a feel for what the rest of this team is going to be doing. As you can see, we have a whole bunch of people headed over towards A, and not a whole lot of stuff headed towards C or D. That's a little bit concerning, just because there's an equal amount of map over there and twice as many objectives. And though I don't feel really good about it, I think somebody ought to try to cover that flank. Now you will notice that we are shooting some HE here. That is basically because anytime you've got a bow in battleship, you're not going to be able to really do anything other than get some HE damage. And so at the beginning of the game, at least, we're going to go ahead and stick with that. There's one of the ships that we're a little worried about, which is Georgia. Georgia can punch the bow and stern of this ship very, very easily with 18-inch guns. And now we're rolling out, even though we're not really a cruiser, we do have a little bit of utility that will help our team in terms of dealing with the destroyer that is clearly out here. We had spotted the Akizuki earlier in the game. That's probably a good thing because it doesn't have that many torpedoes. But it's still not something I want to get shot by. Now we're doing a lot of fiddling around with our speed. I will say, with this one particular shot, you see 17,000 damage land in the back part of my ship. This is one reason why you don't want to bow in or put yourself stern in towards an enemy ship like that. So we'll just count that as a teachable moment. And we continue to more or less float around in the outside, trying to look for an opening. Now, I am perpetually spotted, which means that the destroyer is closer than I want it to be, and that I even have to deal with it at all is making me a little bit upset, uncomfortable, etc. I'm going to try to use this island to get a feel for where he is. Also, limit his ability to shoot me with torpedoes. That's a nice thing. So as we put out some more shells on the Georgia, you can see we're not doing a lot in terms of damage or anything else for that matter. But what we are doing is making sure that this side of the map just doesn't get straight up overrun. We've lost our spot, and for the moment I think that means that we're probably not going to get shot by torpedoes. I wouldn't mind looking around the outside of that island, but eventually I'm going to run out of map here, and I don't want to get like too far out of field. And you can see with this particular setup I have, we're able to maneuver pretty nicely. This doesn't feel like a battleship, not a full-on battleship. The only downside here is that these turrets do still feel very battleship-like. You can see they're not exactly swinging around with any alacrity. I'm sure that's a word that comes up frequently for you. Now there we can see the Akizuki has been spotted way out there in the middle of nowhere. And we're still making a little bit of damage based on fires. Just like, most actual cruisers do. Put a little bit of help out there on Tirpitz. Land another fire on the bow of his ship. And now we're going to start pushing towards that destroyer, because it looks like our team's doing well enough that we can kind of push a little bit of an opening. And that should help keep that ship away from other slightly more vulnerable targets. Now you saw there we did take a couple of battleship shots. As long as we're maintaining a pretty decent angle against them, the Kronstadt is very tanky. You can get unlucky because basically that upper belt is not going to deal very well with 16-inch guns or higher. So there is that. You get a little bit more trouble with American battleships since they have improved penetration angles and there's not really great ways to angle against them. And this particular boat, kind of like Azuma, kind of like Siegfried, we're using our RPF there, the indicator on the top of the screen, to see where we think this particular destroyer is. Come on, select the right guy. Yeah, there we go. We select, we aim, we fire, and yeah, we have battleship dispersion. We land all sorts of things in the area of the destroyer, but obviously nothing on him. And our short-term Soviet radar is already gone. Now that the Georgia's ducking behind that island, we're going to start moving forward again. That Akizuki is way too far away for me to reliably hit him. And you can see, even though we're a Russian ship, there's a pretty significant difference between my ultimate range and the range where I can be spotted, even just looking on the mini-map. So we have a pretty comfortable buffer here based on this kind of setup. This is more or less the setup that one of two setups that I kind of enjoyed the most. The other one was actually with Kedrov, and it had mostly to do with just surviving in the game and shooting a lot of HE at people. You can see we're doing plenty of HE shooting in this particular game. Unless there was a cruiser in front of me, I would probably stick with this. At closer ranges, like I wouldn't shoot a lot of AP at things that are 17 kilometers away from me, period. But you can definitely Citadel some of the less protected battleships pretty easily. But you're also nicely in the area of, you know, not too heavy that you just go straight through every cruiser. So really you do land quite a few nice citadels in those situations. There you can see I turned a little bit out after the Georgia hit me. That was mostly to take away my nose and to try to give him more of my belt to shoot at, because he'll go straight through the nose of this ship. And frankly, we don't want him to aim there. Against a good player, you might find that this ship is a little bit more frustrating to play, because if they just take the auto aim, they'll probably put it right in your belt if you're doing what I'm doing right here. But if they're not doing that, then what you're going to get is people who know how to shoot at your nose, and those people will murder you quite a bit. In any case, we do manage to survive charging at the Georgia. And now we're going to go ahead, push into C. We are again spotted. This would be an excellent time for somebody to be near me so that I could maybe help them, or maybe they could help me. I try to give that guy a little bit of a heads up that there is a destroyer in that area. I have no way of knowing if he would actually, kind of listen to that. But you do see that he got some shots off there. I actually hit the Akizuki the first time, but I hit him for, I think, 0 damage, which is a little frustrating. In any case, you can see we're going to go ahead, capture this particular base, and then we're going to try to move in to help the rest of our team deal with the Vladivostok and the Flandre over on the other side of the map. For being kind of a big cruiser, you do have pretty decent speed. That's not one of the things that I usually find myself too worried about in Kronstadt. I mostly worry about the matchmaker, and I mostly worry about getting dunked on by enemy battleships. And this will give us a little bit of opportunity to shoot long range over an island without getting spotted. We do manage to land a couple of hits, and we finish off the game. Now, I like this particular replay mostly because it shows the Kronstadt struggling to do things on its own, which is something that I felt happened quite a bit. And it's not just one of these games where you go out and do a ton of damage. We had to work a little bit for that one. And I actually got citadeled in it at the beginning, which was useful to see, even if it wasn't fun. So anyway, final thoughts on the Kronstadt. I mean, the most interesting thing about it is probably the history. Points for trying Soviet Union. I'm sure if the Germans had given them another decade to build it, they could have finished her and she would have sat in port all the same. In the game, she probably currently benefits from not having a lot of competition, but if I wanted to play a ship like this, I would personally probably go with Siegfried or Azuma. Opinions may vary there because having radar is very useful, and having loads of HP is definitely always a plus. But right now, she's just a quick ticket into a game full of Yamato-class battleships, which means that you're not the one usually dictating how the match plays out. You do a lot of whittling until you can finally spread your wings and fly, but being so limited by that does mean that you can't exploit your strengths as often as you might like. So, like the Russian Navy in World War II, this one will probably mostly sit in my port, but right now that kind of also describes all ships at Tier 8. That's just my take on it. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and as always, I'll see you on the next one.